Thank you for joining me today to hear about the requirements input gathering approach and findings for the DPSC planning project. My name is Hannah Wang, and I am the co-PI and project director for this 18-month grant funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I'll start by giving an introduction to who we are and where the project is coming from. The Digital Preservation Services Collaborative, or the DPScooters, is a loose collective of community-based distributed digital preservation service providers. We provide digital preservation services to academic and cultural heritage organizations, focusing primarily on robust distributed preservation storage. Among the members, there is variation in terms of storage implementation, types of organizations served, governance and staffing models, and types of microservices offered. The DPScooters formed in 2017 by representatives from several service providers who all operated nodes for the now defunct Digital Preservation Network, or DPIN. That included APTrust, UC San Diego, which hosts the Chronopolis service, APTrust, and Texas Digital Library. At the time, the people running these nodes were already having conversations about how to work together better, but they realized that in order to do so, they needed to craft shared value statements that would underlie the work that they did together. They also hoped that these value statements would clarify the independent but non-competitive nature of the DPIN nodes to internal and external stakeholders. This core group also recruited other service providers that they had connections to in order to help write these statements, including DuraSpace and various LOCKSS networks, including the MetaArchive Cooperative. When DPIN sunsetted, members of the DPScooters were able to work together to craft shared messaging and ensure that none of their members' content was impacted by the sunset. So there's a link that I'll also drop in the chat to our Declaration of Shared Values, which can be found on the Digital Preservation Services Collaborative website. So for the purposes of this project, these are the representatives from each of the service providers in the Digital Preservation Services Collaborative who are partnering on this 18-month planning grant. So this includes Alicia Wise from CLOCKSS, Bradley Daigle from APTrust, Courtney Muma from Texas Digital Library, myself, I work at Educopia Institute, and I'm the community facilitator for the MetaArchive Cooperative. Lydia Tang, who works at LYRASIS and works on DuraCloud, as well as Sybil Schaefer, who works at UC San Diego on Chronopolis. We're also joined in this project by our consultant, Ryan Menifee from Group Project, who has assisted with our requirements gathering phase and will also be facilitating us through the service model design, which I'll talk about in a moment. So what are we trying to accomplish in this project? To date, the DPScooters have worked primarily together on values, advocacy, and shared messaging. We are all deeply embedded in the digital preservation community. We have served as collaborators, advocates, instructors, community members in cross-organizational efforts like the Digital Preservation Coalition and the National Digital Stewardship Alliance. We realize that there are things that we do uniquely well. This includes things like community empowerment through governance and education, collaborative development, and also transparency. We also realize that there are areas that we can improve, and perhaps through collaboration, we can strengthen the quality and accessibility of our services and make it easier to join in community efforts and articulate the value of community-governed digital preservation. Another impetus for this project is about being able to work within the selection and purchasing processes in place, especially at academic organizations, and to better advocate for the value of community-supported digital preservation to decision makers who are often trying to outsource to a commercial vendor. Usually, this kind of work requires a lot of upwards advocacy by practitioners and is often only successful within an organization that might be predisposed to supporting mission-aligned and open source communities in the first place. So another question of this project is, how can we make interventions to support practitioners and build the community? And this is one place where the service model comes in. How can we better serve our current users and also become more accessible to prospective users? So we're working together on this planning project to explore that original question of how can we work better together, or how can we work together better? Starting from our foundation of shared values, we are gathering requirements and exploring possible futures for a shared service model that introduces efficiencies and promotes sustainability among the partners, while still maintaining enough independence and administrative diversity to foster a sustainable ecosystem at the field level. So in short, we're working to determine the best way to combine the efforts of our partners to work toward a common goal of providing community-supported, values-driven digital preservation services, and to design a collaborative and multi-tiered service model for distributed digital preservation. So how will we get there? Like I said at the beginning, this is an 18-month planning grant. We started with kickoff and recruitment, and during recruitment, we were really endeavoring to recruit a balanced and representative advisory board with a range of expertise and a service user group who are our primary group of stakeholders in this project, who represent a range of organization sizes, represent both current users and non-users of our services, and contain a mix of practitioners and also administrative decision makers. The next phase, which we are towards the end of right now, is requirements gathering. So we are gathering inputs for comparative analysis of our current service offerings, and also the needs and procurement requirements of our current and prospective users. The last phase of the project is service modeling, where we will be developing a design for a future collaborative digital preservation service model. There will be several iterations on this model, which will be presented at a virtual forum to our stakeholders in August. So the phase that we're in right now is requirements gathering, and that is consisting of 3 parallel activities. The ones that I'm going to focus on for the purposes of today's presentation are the latter 2 activities on this slide, which are the primary survey for end users and our end user interviews. And point of clarification, by end users, we mean individuals and organizations who use digital preservation services. So in this case, we're talking about mostly librarians, archivists, collection managers, and the people they work with and their supervisors, rather than patrons. We're not referring to patrons or users of library services in this case. So we distributed a survey in the spring of 2023. And the survey itself had 68 total respondents. And the responses came from kind of the usual suspects. It's fairly representative of the kinds of responses that we get in the digital preservation field to these types of surveys. The respondents were primarily coming from academic libraries and archives, and also were primarily located in the United States. We asked users to identify themselves by a list of roles, which were actually borrowed from the NDSA staffing survey as a kind of model of useful categories of different types of people who take place in, who have some role in digital preservation. So as you can see from this slide, a majority of respondents were not senior level administrative decision makers. Majority of respondents were, identified as some type of practitioner, with about a quarter of respondents being someone who contributes to developing policies, guidelines, and activities, and also somebody who performs specific activities. We did receive about 10% of responses that were from senior level administrators or executives. Our End user interviews, we interviewed 7 different individuals. Some of them were asked to participate directly, just based on connections that we had and presentations that we in the project had attended. And then others volunteered to participate in an interview when they were taking the primary survey. For the purposes of our findings and results, we have anonymized the interview responses, but included quotes because they really add a lot of rich context for the types of responses that we got. So instead of having people's names, we have these descriptions for the types of roles and positionalities that they have within their organizations, as well as the organizations that they are representing. So we interviewed a range of people from, an associate dean of libraries for a large state university system, to systems architects, more of an IT person in a large state university library, a digital archivist for a smaller regional museum in the West, an associate director of digital preservation for a large library system in the Northeast, a couple of digital preservation librarians from different types of institutions, as well as a director of collections with digital preservation oversight responsibilities for a private regional university library in the Midwest. So what we learned, we collected a variety of responses that basically informed our conception of what our end users' reality is, and specifically the obstacles that they face in prioritizing digital preservation and the specific challenges that they're facing around digital preservation within their institutions. So one category of this kind of obstacles and realities is priorities, strategy, and mission realities. Public-facing organizations may tend to prioritize access over preservation, and this is one of the things that can make it hard to advocate for digital preservation when there is such a strong mandate and push towards providing access. In many cases, a single individual may be responsible for all digital preservation activities for an organization. And even within that, only a small portion of their time may be dedicated to preservation. Additionally, capacity constraints on developer time can make it hard for digital preservation to be prioritized within some organizations. So many organizations don't even have IT support for digital preservation and other kinds of digital library activities. But even for those that do, it can be really hard to prioritize specifically digital preservation within the larger remit of those roles' responsibilities. There are also a number of budget realities that limit what can be done in terms of digital preservation. One of them being one-time expenditures and vendor contracts are often easier to secure than personnel time and incremental staff. Many organizations for multiple decades at this point, but especially within the last 5 to 10 years, are operating in austerity budgeting conditions that make it hard to resource anything, much less digital preservation. And digital preservation itself often exists in kind of the margins of budgets, where it competes with the likes of facilities maintenance, because large portions of these budgets are often devoted to personnel, as they should be, but also to collections and acquisitions and things like that. The staffing realities are also somewhat grim and also reflect what we've seen in other surveys in the field, where there are too few staff in number driven by these budget realities. There's also, at least from the responses that we got, too few staff with expertise in digital preservation, which is a field that requires a certain amount of knowledge and expertise. And even highly expert staff, again, may not be fully dedicated to digital preservation activities. They often have a role that encompasses a number of different preservation or collections activities. So in the next few slides, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the vendor selection process for digital preservation services. And these findings come primarily from our interviews. With these questions, we were interested in finding out more about the impetus driving organizations to find third-party support for digital preservation and how our services currently do or don't fit that need. So one of the major reasons that we found that organizations seek third-party service provider support for digital preservation, so they're going outside their institution to get support for some aspect of their digital preservation strategy, is to address local storage issues. So many organizations are finding that the costs of storage have become just enormous and driven by central IT chargebacks from their host institution. Many organizations are running out of storage locally, which is driven by the volume of content that's being preserved, specifically through mass digitization efforts over the last decade or two. That was something that came up a lot in our interviews. Some organizations had been using their digital asset management system as a kind of preservation repository, but are finding at this point that it is insufficient for their preservation requirements. And some institutions, over the last couple of decades had built homegrown repositories and are at this point finding that they're failing and putting preservation at risk. So a quote from one of our interviewees that speaks to a number of the things on this slide. We had just embarked on a digitization project that was overwhelming to everything we did. My boss looked at our digital repository and said, well, number one, I don't trust that system. And number two, it hasn't been able to cope with what we've been asking it to do. So this was one of the reasons cited for why they started looking for a vendor to provide digital preservation services. Another reason is that staffing realities, which I talked about a little bit before, don't allow for the creation and maintenance of homegrown digital preservation systems anymore. So this is a quote actually from a kind of self-identified, self-described open source advocate who said, I kept thinking we're going to build the preservation repository next, and it's going to be an open source because commercial is big and evil and expensive. But then we came to the realization that it was going to be hard to prioritize digital preservation with our development capacity. So even people who are advocates for open source tooling and building open source repositories are basically faced with the reality that staffing will not be able to maintain these homegrown systems. Related to that, staff turnover, especially in library IT departments, threatens comprehensive knowledge transfer of how to manage homegrown digital preservation systems. So this is a perspective from one of our interviewees who works in library IT. And he said it started with the thought that we should potentially move to a third party so that we would have support in case we have staff turnover, or to make it so that if we have problems, there can be more than just one person who understands what we're working on. So outsourcing in this case, or looking for a third party service provider for digital preservation, is a way to mitigate the risk that comes with staff turnover. And lastly, because it's important for the organization to do some amount of preservation stewardship and there's no other feasible way to get it done. So this is a perspective from a smaller organization who said, we don't need to be at the bleeding edge or have the most complicated or fanciest kind of tool at the ready. We just need to get ourselves to a good enough kind of place, fulfilling our professional duties based on our ethics and best practices. So again, these are from our interviews, but this is kind of an overview of the different reasons that organizations may seek third-party service provider support in the first place for digital preservation. Another interesting thing that we found through our interviews is that the goals for the digital preservation vendor selection process are not just to select a vendor. So again, this is also from our interviews. And obviously, the primary reason to go through this vendor selection process is to identify the best vendor for your needs and also to be able to feel confident about that choice. One secondary goal for this process that we heard from multiple of our respondents was to educate or re-educate internal partners within the organization about what digital preservation is and why it's important. And in some cases, the vendor itself does a lot of that education work for you through presentations. So in this case, Digital Archivist said, Preservica does a ton of teaching work for us, including for people who have no understanding of digital preservation other than the words digital preservation. It's been really helpful for me not needing to explain why digital preservation matters at a fundamental level. And this was, a finding not just at small institutions, but also at much larger ones. The RFP process was an educational process for our digital partners who were resistant to the idea that we needed anything at all for digital preservation. We could have presentations that tell us, here's what other people do. Do you do this? Okay, you don't. Here's a product that does it already. And unfortunately, a lot of times this messaging is more effective coming from somebody who works outside of your organization than somebody who you work with on a day-to-day basis. And the other kind of secondary reason is to build the necessary coalition of support within an organization that is aligned around the vision for digital preservation and can inform the selection process. And this is a pretty, it's very resource and time intensive process, but it is, I think, a very critical process that not all organizations or practitioners have the bandwidth to do, is this socialization and coalition building. So this is a quote that says, digital preservation in the long term is just going to grow in terms of how much it consumes a library budget. And it's going to be in the spotlight in tough budget times. I wanted to develop a coalition to demonstrate broad support within the organization to prioritize digital preservation and to allocate those resources. So this is another kind of, I think, really savvy way to use the vendor selection process, is to help kind of structure this coalition building process within an organization. So we have kind of a rough general timeline of how the service provider selection process generally goes at these institutions. First being that socialization and coalition building. Then moving into requirements generation. This is a place where, and I'll talk about in a moment, there are some potential interventions that could be done, because some organizations do hire a consultant from outside the organization to come in and help generate their requirements. Next step is vendor research, which is interesting because vendor research is, there aren't that many vendors that provide digital preservation services, but even within the landscape of digital preservation service providers, there are constraints that basically limit the providers that any given institution is looking at. Most organizations do have unique requirements that immediately narrow their search to just a handful of potential candidates. These unique requirements can range from anything like, they did a massive AV digitization project and now they have all these really big files. That's a constraint. Other constraints include, systems that need to be integrated with at their library, and also where geographically copies of their content can be stored for legal reasons. The next step is consultation with peers. So organizations and practitioners are strongly influenced by the experiences and opinions of their trusted colleagues within and outside of the organization, formal and informal networks. So things like NDSA, but also smaller Slack groups and conferences that people attend. And then also, something that is highly influential is, what are our peers doing? What service is X university doing that, is in the same region and we see as our peer or competitor? And also, what is for instance, Harvard doing? What's Yale doing? What are these aspirational organizations doing that we want to kind of model in some way? And then the last step is meeting vendors and going through some kind of pilot or trial. Most of the interviewees that we talked to were in the middle of a multi-year pilot period with their selected vendor. So one of the things that we asked in the survey is, what's a convincing argument to dedicate more resources to digital preservation or similar? And the reason that we asked this was because we were interested in what kinds of talking points practitioners have found useful within their organizations for justifying digital preservation, because that's also something that we as service providers can help uplift and incorporate into our messaging. So one of the most common themes is strategic alignment or mission alignment. So if preservation is one aspect of your mission, that's kind of a gimme. Access, so pointing to preservation as a precondition for access. So you can point to things like usage statistics, the shift to hybrid, remote, and distance learning, and both persistent and immediate access mandates, which do in a lot of ways require preservation to be underlying access. Reputational embarrassment, which came up in a couple of ways. One of them tied back to that peer or aspirational institution concept. So looking at what they're doing and seeing that they're already investing in digital preservation. So it's something that we as an organization should do as well. Managing the risks of losing collections was another thing that came up. Digital preservation, the reason that you do it in the first place is to make sure that you don't inadvertently lose access to content that you need access to in the future. So pointing out the risks of losing collections or pointing to previous cases where collections have been lost is a good way to justify digital preservation. There's the fiscal analogy. So looking at what kinds of resources are being dedicated in your organization to physical preservation of books and archival materials, and then looking at the gap between that and resources that are dedicated to digital preservation, which is often severely lacking. Fiscal stewardship. So particularly for institutions that in the last couple of decades have gotten, grants or dedicated a lot of resources to mass digitization efforts. Now you have to hang on to that stuff. Now you have to figure out how to preserve it. So you're protecting the institution's prior investment to digitization efforts. And lastly, compliance. So in some cases, there are laws and regulations that mandate persistent access and preservation. So that's another thing to point to. So there's a lot of information on this next slide. Basically, in this question, we had a big list of different potential requirements that people could select as being important to their digital preservation vendor selection process. So they were asked to select all that apply, and then they were asked to basically, rank them from slightly important to extremely important. So basically what you're seeing here is the list of requirements from most important to most respondents in the survey to least important. There are a couple of interesting things to point out here. Exit strategy came out on top, which I'll talk about in a second. The other things that came up that are interesting to point to are things like trust and access to a community of practice, which were very highly ranked within the top 10. And those are things that the dip scooters, the services represented in our collaborative, do especially well. And it's something that our current users really value about our services. Price and total cost of ownership don't show up until a little bit, after all of these other more systems related factors. And then, I'll talk a little bit about exit strategy, because I think that this was something that came up both in the survey itself as a very important requirement, and then also through our interviews. So exit strategy is basically some kind of stipulation, usually in your contract, or some kind of, functional requirement that means that you can get your content out of the service provider without, there's not going to be vendor lock-in, essentially. So you can get your stuff out and then migrate it into another system. This is really important for any kind of library system, but especially digital preservation, because no service is ever going to be around forever. So you need to have some way to get your content out and put into another network, service, system, whatever. So one of the interviewees that we talked about how one of the key things that constrained or limited our vendor selection was the exit strategy. With LibSafe, which is a LibNova product, you get credentials right to the S3 bucket where copies are stored, and you can pick those up and lift them out at any time. This was echoed by another respondent who said, the fact that we could very easily download materials was really important. If we want to quietly migrate, we could very effectively. You don't want to spook a vendor when you're looking to migrate out, and the fact that we could do that quietly was really important. So not only being able to get your stuff out, but also not having to notify the vendor, ask the vendor for permission to access your content in order to get it out. So within this project, we did have an ingoing hypothesis that values-based and for-profit service providers were seen as different choices. So on one end, we have the for-profit commercial vendors of digital preservation services, and then on the other end, values-based. So we put, the well-known commercial vendors on one end, and then ourselves at the other. And we thought that this was kind of the spectrum. What we were really asking was, how much does it matter that a service provider is values-based on that end of the spectrum versus for-profit in the selection process? Is this something that enters our current and prospective users' minds when they're looking at digital preservation service providers? And basically, is there a value proposition to being values-based? And what we found is it actually doesn't matter that much. The vendor selection process and ultimately vendor preference and choice is driven and determined by functional requirements above all else. It has to work for your organization and for your collections. An end user's unique requirements and constraints shape the entire vendor selection process by limiting the number of potential candidates. And end users, this was a really interesting thing that came up a lot in our interviews, but end users are very clear-eyed about the risks around both using for-profit commercial vendors and also using often nonprofit values-based vendors. So in the case of for-profit vendors, some of the risks that came up in our interviews were the ease of the exit strategy. So again, you're always worried about vendor lock-in in these situations. Similarly, being constrained to the vendor's APIs or proprietary data models to access your stored data. And also, I think just in the current kind of social cultural environment, there is a lot of reasonable fear associated with using these large for-profit organizations for anything that any of your personal data, essentially. So there are fears about vendors using your preserved data to do things like train AI models and other kind of nefarious things like that. On the other end, there are also a lot of risks that are named about the values-based service providers. So there's service sustainability, especially after the sunset of the digital preservation network. This is something that gets called into question quite a bit. The home institution relationship. So what kind of relationship does that service provider that's often located at a university or a nonprofit, what is that relationship like? Does that threaten sustainability? Are there weird relationships between our organization and that organization? And then also IT dependencies. Some of the values-based service providers do require some extent of customization and integration that has to be done by your local IT, and that's a dependency that can turn into a risk. And then lastly, interviewees did note that consortial services, so many of the services that are represented in the DIP scooters are consortial services, and many of them are insufficient for the whole scope of their digital preservation needs, because we focus primarily on distributed preservation storage and not for exerting intellectual control over content. So some of the upstream active preservation management processes that need to be undertaken for your digital preservation strategy can't be done like within the scope of our services. We assume that you have other systems locally that are doing that. So it's not, none of us are really providing currently an end-to-end system. So revisiting that spectrum that we had, we've revised it and are thinking that a more helpful spectrum for evaluating service providers would be prescriptive versus flexible and extensible. So on one end, we have systems that really tell you how you're going to do digital preservation and make you kind of conform to that model. And there's very low user control. And then at the other end, we have systems that are more flexible, extensible, integratable, and configurable. And on one end, we do have some of the service providers like Preservica, which are generally more prescriptive about how you do digital preservation, and do generally take more of a black box approach. One thing that we found in our interviews is that this is not necessarily seen as a bad thing. Some organizations really want this, and not just organizations that don't have a lot of staffing. Even some organizations that do have a lot of staffing don't necessarily want the ability to go in and muck around in the system and make a lot of customizations. They want it to basically be a full service that they're just using and not having to make any customizations for. On the other end, we do have systems that are more flexible, extensible, integratable, and configurable. And based on these learnings, what are some of the opportunities that we found for the DPSC, the DIP scooters, to be resilient, sustainable, inclusive, extensible, and adaptable to end user needs? So we've identified two major vectors of opportunity for our services to potentially explore in the next phase of the project. So one of them is expanding collective offerings beyond preservation, storage, and communities, potentially including that more upfront active preservation and intellectual control over content piece, potentially giving the capability to have more of an end-to-end system, which is also where access comes into play for some institutions, particularly those that have fewer resources. They really do need one system that provides both preservation and access. And then there are potential upstream services that shape preservation strategies and vendor choices, which would be essentially potential interventions during that service provider selection process. So we could explore upstream services that help end users understand the landscape of consortial service providers, build sustaining coalitions within their organizations, doing that really resource-intensive work that's really necessary for digital preservation. Calculating the total cost of ownership of their preservation solution. This is something that a lot of practitioners and really organizations as a whole don't have a lot of insight into. So not just the licensing or subscription costs to your service, but also all of the outside costs that it takes to maintain that. So local personnel, also potentially, paying for increased bandwidth at your organization to be able to upload very large files to the cloud, things like that. Articulating functional requirements, being ready for digital preservation. This is something that comes up a lot, even once organizations do have a sense of what provider they want to use or even have a contract with that provider, they're not necessarily ready to start using the service. They need to make their content ready for preservation. They need to put policies and workflows in place. And that's a lot of work, and it really does need to be done upfront before you can really start taking advantage of a digital preservation service. And the second major vector of opportunity is to develop a coherent, well-defined interface between the services. So this could look like an end user interface where you can both see the whole landscape of consortial service providers and also make informed decisions about what you want to do with your content, which provider you want to send it to. Or it could look like more of a back-end collaboration interface. How do we, as service providers on the back end, share resources and exchange data to kind of have more of a coherent interface? So some of the next steps are aligning on these opportunities within the DPSC. We have shared these with the service user group and the advisory board for their reactions and feedback, and then we're going to use these findings to articulate requirements for a future service model. So that's the end of my presentation, and I am happy to take questions and feedback.